The dust of forward operating base Kestrel settled on everything. A fine, ochre powder that coated skin, weapons, and patience with equal impunity. It was a place that existed on the frayed edge of the map, a temporary constellation of Hesco barriers and canvas tents thrown down in a valley carved by unforgiving mountains. Into this grit and tension walked Sergeant Major Elara Vance. She moved without ceremony, stepping out of the back of a dust-caked Oshkosh with a single duffel bag slung over a shoulder that was straight and unbowed despite the years suggested by the silver threads in her tightly bound hair. Her arrival was a non-event. No formal greeting party, no fanfare. Just the crunch of her boots on the gravel and the indifferent stare of the sun. But she was not invisible. Leaning against a sandbagged wall, ostensibly cleaning their rifles, was a fire team from the Marine Force Recon Platoon. They were the FOB's alpha predators, young, hard-muscled, and radiating an aggressive confidence that bordered on arrogance. Their leader, Staff Sergeant Gunny Rivas, watched her approach the command tent, his eyes narrowing. He didn't see a sergeant major. He saw a woman whose face was a roadmap of past violence. A thick, silver scar ran from her left temple down her cheek, pulling the corner of her eye into a permanent, slight squint. Another, finer line bisected her upper lip. Her hands, as she adjusted the strap of her bag, were a tapestry of mottled, burn-scarred skin and healed overcuts. They were the hands of someone who had seen worse things than a long tour in this godforsaken valley. Rivas nudged the man next to him, a wiry corporal named Miller. "Get a load of the new command sergeant major," he muttered, his voice a low drawl meant to carry. "Looks like she got into a fight with a pissed-off badger and lost." Miller snickered, the sound sharp and juvenile. "Heard she's a lifer from personnel, Gunny. Must have been a hell of a paper cut." The third man, Sergeant Chun, remained silent, his eyes on the woman. He watched the way she walked, an efficient, ground-eating stride with no wasted motion. He saw the way her gaze swept the perimeter, not as a tourist, but as someone assessing fields of fire, dead space, and potential threats. He saw the calm, the unnerving stillness in her posture. He didn't join the laughter. Vance heard them. The wind carried their words as clearly as if they'd been spoken into a radio. She gave no sign. Her expression didn't change. Her pace didn't falter. She had been dealing with men like Rivas her entire career. Men who measured worth in decibels and muscle mass, who saw scars as a sign of weakness overcome rather than a testament to survival. Their dismissiveness was just another environmental factor like the heat or the dust. You didn't complain about it. You worked around it. Inside the command tent, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and nervous energy. General Marcus Thorne stood before a massive digital map, his back to the entrance. He was a tall, lean man whose authority was worn as comfortably as his crisply starched uniform. "Sergeant Major," he said, without turning around. He'd heard the crunch of her boots stop just inside the tent flap. "Sir," Vance replied. Her voice was low, with a gravelly timbre that suggested disuse. Thorne finally turned, his eyes giving her a quick, professional appraisal. He noted the scars, of course. It was impossible not to, but his face registered nothing more than mild curiosity. "Welcome to Kestrel. Things are kinetic." "They usually are, sir. Your reputation precedes you, Sergeant Major. Records say you're one of the best administrative minds in the Corps. We need that. This task force is a logistical nightmare." Vance simply nodded. An administrative mind. That was what he saw. That was what the file said. She was here to organize supply chains, manage personnel rotations, and ensure the unending river of paperwork flowed in the right direction. She was a senior NCO, a glorified clerk in the eyes of the operators who did the real work. It was a role she had accepted, a quiet epilogue to a career whose most important chapters were sealed in black ink and buried in a classified archive. "Find your rack, get settled," Thorne continued, turning back to his map. "Briefing for Operation Serpent's Tooth at 1800. I want you there. You need to know what your Marines are walking into." "Yes, sir," she said, and with another quiet crunch of boots she was gone. As the tent flap fell shut, Thorn's aide, a young captain, cleared his throat. "Sir, with respect, Force Recon isn't going to take kindly to oversight from a personnel NCO." Thorn grunted. "They don't have to like her. They just have to respect the rank. And Rivas needs to learn that not every problem can be solved with a door kick and a flashbang. Maybe she'll be a good influence." He tapped the map, his mind already on the mission. He didn't give Sergeant Major Vance another thought. He had a snake to catch. Outside, the whispers continued, and the dust, indifferent to rank or reputation, kept settling. The briefing room was a cramped, plywood box, smelling of sweat and whiteboard markers. General Thorn stood at the head of the table, his face illuminated by the projector's pale light. The digital map showed a labyrinthine village clinging to the side of a mountain, identified as Al-Quba. "Gentlemen, Sergeant Major," Thorn began, his voice crisp. "Our target is Tariq al-Hamdan. Nom de guerre, the Serpent. He's a high-level bomb maker and insurgent commander. Intel places him in this compound here." A red circle appeared on the map. "He's protected by at least 24 loyal fighters, well armed and, according to our source, expecting trouble." Gunny Rivas leaned forward, his arms crossed over his chest. His team was arrayed around him, a pack of coiled springs. He exuded a predatory confidence. "Sir, my team can be in and out in 20 minutes. We'll go fast and hard. Standard infill is via the valley road to the south. We hit the compound before they know what's happening." Thorn nodded, considering it. It was the textbook approach. Direct, overwhelming force. From the back of the room, where she sat slightly apart from the others, Vance spoke. Her voice was quiet but cut through the low murmur. "Sir, what's our intel on the northern ridge?" Rivas turned his head slowly, a smirk playing on his lips. He looked at her as if she were a curious child who had wandered into an adult conversation. "It's a goat trail, Sergeant Major. Impassable for our vehicles. A 6-hour climb on foot, minimum. We'd lose the element of surprise completely. The satellite imagery shows recent soil displacement along the valley road," Vance stated, her eyes fixed on the map, not on Rivas. "Consistent with IED emplacement. Multiple sites. The south is a funnel. They're inviting us in." Rivas let out a short, derisive laugh. "With all due respect, Sergeant Major, we're Force Recon. We spot IEDs. That's what we do. We don't get paid to take scenic hikes." Miller and a few others chuckled along with him. The dismissal was palpable, thick enough to taste. She was a paper pusher, a creature of the rear echelon, offering timid advice to men who wrestled with death for a living. Vance didn't flinch. She simply added, "The northern approach offers multiple overwatch positions that dominate the village. A small support-by-fire element on that ridge could suppress the entire compound while the assault team moves in from the west, using the dead ground in that ravine." She traced a line on the projected map with a laser pointer she hadn't appeared to be holding a moment before. Her proposed route was intricate, difficult, and slower. It was the route of a patient hunter, not a charging bull. "Too slow, too complicated," Rivas countered immediately, shaking his head. "We go in fast, we own the night. The longer we're out there, the more can go wrong. That's doctrine." General Thorn stood listening, his expression unreadable. He looked from his confident platoon leader to the quiet sergeant major. His operators were the best in the world at direct action. They were trained for speed and violence. Vance's analysis was sound, logical, but it was cautious. In this line of work, caution could get you killed just as quickly as recklessness. He made his decision. "We stick with the primary plan," Thorn said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "The southern approach. Rivas, your team has the assault. I want 2 gun trucks for fire support. Eyes on the target is paramount. We cannot let him slip away." "You got it, sir," Rivas said, a triumphant gleam in his eye. He shot a quick, smug look at Vance, who met his gaze without expression. She said nothing more. She didn't argue or protest. She simply gave a short, sharp nod, accepting the general's command. She had offered her assessment based on years of reading maps just like this one, of seeing situations just like this one play out. It had been dismissed. So be it. Her job now was to support the Marines executing the mission, regardless of her opinion of the plan. As the meeting broke up, the recon team filed out, their talk loud and confident. Rivas paused by Vance's chair. "Don't you worry, Sergeant Major," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "We'll be back before your coffee gets cold. You just keep the paperwork in order for us." He walked away, followed by the sycophantic laughter of his corporal. Sergeant Chun, the last one out, hesitated for a moment. He looked at Vance, at the deep, unreadable calm in her eyes, at the scarred hands resting motionless on the table. He saw no anger, no frustration. He saw only a profound stillness, the kind of stillness that comes from weathering storms far greater than a cocky staff sergeant's mockery. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod before following his team into the dusty evening. Vance watched them go, her gaze distant, already seeing the valley road not as it was on the map, but as it would be in 3 hours. A gallery of fire, a carefully prepared tomb. The first explosion was a dull, crumping thud that vibrated through the floor of the Tactical Operations Center. On the main screen, the drone feed, a ghostly black and white image from 10,000 feet, flickered violently. A bloom of white-hot energy erupted at the front of the small convoy. The lead gun truck, a lumbering beast of armor and firepower, was tossed sideways as if by an invisible hand, slewing into a ditch. "Contact! Voodoo 1 is hit. IED." The voice crackling over the comms was tight with adrenaline and fear. General Thorne swore, leaning closer to the screen. "Talk to me, Rivas. What's your status?" "We're in it, sir. It's a goddamn kill box." Rivas's voice was strained, the earlier arrogance vaporized by the shock of combat. Heavy machine gun fire from the East Ridge. Mortars walking in. They're everywhere. On the screen, tiny, brilliant flashes stitched across the landscape as tracers from a heavy weapon raked the remaining vehicle. The heat signatures of the recon Marines scattered, seeking cover in the shallow ditches along the road. It was exactly the funnel Vance had described. In the TOC, a cold dread began to set in. The operators were pinned, taking effective, coordinated fire from prepared positions. The enemy wasn't just a handful of local fighters. This was a professional ambush. "Voodoo 2, this is Raven's Nest. We are taking casualties. Miller's hit. I repeat, Miller is down." Another voice, calmer, cut in. "Comms are breaking up." Heavy jamming, the signal devolved into a wash of static, punctuated by the distant, rhythmic thump of a machine gun. Then silence. "Get me that channel back." Thorne roared at the comms technician, who was frantically working his console. "Can't, sir. They're using a broadband jammer. It's sophisticated stuff." The drone circled uselessly overhead, its feed showing a scene of controlled chaos. Smoke billowed from the crippled truck. The muzzle flashes from the enemy positions were relentless. The pinned-down heat signatures of the Marines were terrifyingly static. They were trapped. Vance stood at the back of the TOC, a silent, still figure amidst the frantic energy. She watched the screen, her squinted eye taking in every detail. The location of the enemy fire, the lack of viable cover for the pinned team, the trajectory of the incoming mortar rounds. Her face was a mask of concentration, betraying no emotion, no hint of "I told you so." She was processing, analyzing, calculating. While Thorne and his staff tried desperately to reestablish communication or task a quick reaction force that was 20 minutes away at best, Vance turned and walked out of the tent. No one noticed her leave. Their attention was riveted on the unfolding disaster on the screen. She moved with a quiet, deliberate purpose. Her first stop was the armory. She didn't grab a standard M4 from the rack. Instead, she went to a locked case in the back, one containing specialized equipment. She keyed in a code from memory. Inside rested an M110 SAS, a semi-automatic sniper system. It was an older model, but this one was different. It was her own, meticulously maintained, its stock and scope worn smooth from countless hours of handling. It was a relic from another life, a tool she had not expected to use again. She slung the rifle and grabbed a go bag that was already packed, its contents specific and non-standard. Extra magazines loaded with match-grade ammunition, a compact spotting scope, a wind meter, and several items whose purpose was not immediately obvious. Her next stop was the motor pool. She bypassed the armored MRAPs and gun trucks, heading for a Polaris MRZR, a light, skeletal all-terrain vehicle designed for speed and maneuverability. She threw her gear in the back, fired up the engine with a low growl, and pulled out of the motor pool, turning not south toward the ambush site, but north. She drove without lights, a ghost moving through the darkness. She was heading for the Goat Trail, the impassable ridge that Rivas had so arrogantly dismissed. The vehicle bucked and climbed, its engine straining, but Vance handled it with an expert's touch, her scarred hands sure on the wheel. She read the terrain in the dim moonlight, navigating the treacherous path with an instinct that felt more animal than human. She was taking the route she had proposed, the one they had all ignored. She was going to provide the overwatch they had deemed unnecessary. She was going alone. The wind whipped at her face, cold and sharp. The distant, muffled sounds of the firefight grew clearer as she gained elevation. It was a sound she knew intimately, the brutal percussion of a life she had tried to leave behind. But like the scars on her face, the past was not something you could simply file away. Sometimes it came calling, and when it did, you answered. The MRZR could take her only so far. Vance killed the engine in a small, rocky alcove 1,000 feet below the summit of the northern ridge. The rest of the way was on foot. She slung the M110 and her pack, the weight familiar and centering. The climb was punishing, a near-vertical scramble over loose scree and sharp-edged rock. She moved with a climber's economy, her breathing steady and deep, her body a well-honed machine. The years fell away with each upward step, replaced by the muscle memory of 1,000 other clandestine ascents in mountains just as dark and hostile as these. She reached the summit as the first hint of pre-dawn light began to soften the eastern horizon. The air was thin and bitingly cold. Below her, the valley was laid out like a sand table. She could see the entire engagement area. The smoldering wreck of the gun truck, the pinned-down position of the recon team, and, most importantly, the enemy's positions. They were exactly where she had predicted they would be. 3 machine gun nests formed a triangle of interlocking fire. A mortar team was dug in behind a rocky outcrop, and moving between the positions was a single figure, clearly in command, directing the fire. Vance unslung her rifle. She didn't rush. Panic was a luxury she had never afforded herself. She moved to a spot she had already picked out from the satellite imagery, a narrow crevice between 2 large boulders that offered a stable firing platform and near-perfect concealment. She laid a small, rolled-up mat on the ground, settled in behind the rifle, and deployed its bipod. Her movements were fluid, economical, a ritual performed countless times. She took out her spotting scope and scanned the battlefield, her mind a cold calculus of distance, wind, and priority. The wind was gusting unpredictably down the valley. She pulled out her Kestrel wind meter, took a reading, and made a minute adjustment to the elevation and windage knobs on her scope. The numbers were just data. The real work was instinct, the feel of the air on her scarred cheek, the way the dust swirled 1,000 yards away. The recon team was in a desperate situation. Their return fire was sporadic, suppressed by the sheer volume coming from the enemy nests. They were being systematically dismantled. Vance settled her eye to the scope, the world shrinking to the circular image in the lens. Her breathing slowed, her heartbeat a steady, powerful drum. She placed the crosshairs on the man who was directing the enemy fighters. He was pointing, shouting orders. A leader, the brain of the ambush. She exhaled half a breath and held it. The world went silent. There was only the reticle, the target, and the space between. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a firm, familiar push. The sound of the shot was a sharp crack, instantly swallowed by the vastness of the mountains. A full second later, the enemy commander collapsed, his body crumpling like a puppet with its strings cut. Before the other fighters could even react, Vance had already cycled the action, acquired her next target, and fired again. The operator of the primary machine gun, the one pouring the most effective fire onto the Marines, was thrown backward from his weapon. One shot, one kill, then another. She worked with a terrifying, methodical rhythm. She wasn't just shooting. She was conducting a symphony of destruction. She targeted the command structure first, then the heavy weapons. A mortarman reaching for another round fell. A radio man trying to call for support dropped his handset and pitched forward. Each shot was a carefully chosen move in a lethal chess game. She made the enemy leaderless, deaf, and toothless in under a minute. The remaining insurgents, suddenly without direction and seeing their comrades fall from an unseen, unheard enemy, began to panic. Their fire became wild, inaccurate. The relentless pressure on the Marines evaporated. Back in the TOC, the chaos had given way to a stunned silence. The comms tech, through a sheer fluke, had managed to punch through the jamming on a narrow, encrypted frequency. It wasn't Voodoo One's channel. It was a ghost channel, one that hadn't been on the active roster for over a decade. A voice, distorted by distance and static but utterly calm, came through the speakers. Threat axis neutralized. All primary targets serviced. Voodoo 1, you are clear to break contact to the west. I have overwatch. Spectre is on station. The call sign hung in the air like a physical thing. Spectre. General Thorne froze. His face went pale. He turned slowly to his aide, his eyes wide with a dawning, impossible realization. Spectre? He whispered, the name tasting like ash and legend in his mouth. Run that call sign. Now! The aide's fingers flew across his keyboard, his face reflecting the screen's green glow. He typed in the name, then a high-level security clearance override. A file appeared. It was heavily redacted, flagged with warnings that would make a seasoned intelligence officer sweat. He stared at it for a long moment, his jaw slack. Sir, he said, his voice barely audible. You need to see this. He turned the monitor toward the general. The file was for a special operations program that had been officially disbanded after the Cold War. A deep cover unit that specialized in solo reconnaissance and targeted elimination in denied areas. They were ghosts, tasked with missions the government would never acknowledge. The program had produced only a handful of operatives. The best, the most legendary of them all, had one name listed. Call sign Spectre. Operative, Alara Vance. The file photo showed a much younger woman, her face unblemished by scars, her eyes holding the same unnerving calm. The service record was a litany of blacked-out mission names and impossible achievements in places like Bosnia, Chechnya, and a dozen other forgotten hellholes. The final entry noted her retirement from the program after being severely wounded during a solo exfiltration. The report detailed grenade shrapnel and burn wounds to her face and hands. It recommended she be reassigned to a quiet administrative role where her tactical knowledge could be utilized in a support capacity. They had buried a ghost in a mountain of paperwork. Thorne stared at the screen, then at the empty chair where Sergeant Major Vance had been sitting less than an hour ago. The quiet, scarred woman he had tasked with logistics. The administrator, the paper pusher Rivas had mocked. He looked back at the main drone feed. The enemy ambush was completely broken. The surviving fighters were fleeing in disarray. Down in the valley, the recon Marines were stirring, taking advantage of the sudden, miraculous reprieve. Thorne understood. Vance hadn't just offered advice. She had given them the answer key to the test, and when they had refused to read it, she had gone out and taken the test for them. She hadn't just saved the mission. She had saved his Marines. He keyed his own mic, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. It was awe. Spectre, this is Raven's Nest. Acknowledged. Well done. The reply came back after a moment, as calm and dispassionate as before. Raven's Nest, Spectre is standing by. Get your people out of there. The pressure was gone. It had vanished as quickly and mysteriously as it had appeared. One moment, Rivas and his team were fighting for every inch of cover, the air thick with bullets and shrapnel. The next, an eerie silence fell over the ridge lines, broken only by the panicked shouts of their now fleeing attackers. Rivas, his face smeared with grime and a trickle of blood from a cut on his forehead, risked a look over his cover. The machine gun nest that had been tearing them to pieces was silent. He saw the slumped form of the gunner draped over his weapon. He scanned the other enemy positions. More bodies. No return fire. It was as if God himself had reached down and swatted their enemies from the face of the earth. "What the hell?" Miller whispered, clutching his wounded arm. "Where did they go?" "Move!" Rivas bellowed, shaking off his confusion. "Let's go. Grab Miller. We're pulling back west now." Seizing the opportunity, the team rallied. They laid down suppressive fire on the retreating insurgents and began a fighting withdrawal, dragging their wounded with them. As they scrambled across the rocky terrain, they saw them, single, precise muzzle flashes from the northern ridge. The goat trail, each flash was followed by the distant, almost gentle crack of a high-velocity round, and each crack resulted in another one of their pursuers falling. It wasn't a firefight. It was an execution. Someone up there was protecting them, dismantling any attempt the enemy made to rally with surgical precision. Rivas knew, with a sickening certainty that coiled in his gut, who was up there. The cautious route, the overwatch position, the advice he had openly mocked. It all came crashing down on him. They reached the designated rally point, a dry riverbed shielded by a low cliff face. An hour later, they were exhausted, battered, and humbled, and she was there. Sergeant Major Vance was waiting for them, leaning against her MRZR, as if she'd been enjoying a casual morning drive. Her rifle was propped against the vehicle's frame, a thin wisp of heat still rising from the barrel. She wasn't cleaning it, wasn't showing off. She was simply watching them approach, her face impassive. As the team collapsed, tending to their wounded, she walked over. She said nothing about the ambush, nothing about her impossibly accurate shooting. She knelt beside Corporal Miller, pulling a fresh field dressing from her own kit. "Let me see that," she said, her voice the same quiet, gravelly tone from the briefing room. Her scarred hands, which Rivas had once seen as a sign of weakness, moved with the gentle, practiced efficiency of a seasoned corpsman. She assessed the wound, cleaned it, and applied a tourniquet high on his arm, her movements swift and sure. Miller, who had laughed at her expense, could only stare, wincing more from shame than from pain. Rivas stood a few feet away, watching. The entire world had been turned upside down. The woman he had dismissed as a desk jockey, a paper pusher with a few unlucky stories, had just single-handedly saved his entire team. She had used a plan he'd called cowardly to perform an act of breathtaking skill and bravery. The arrogance that had been his armor was stripped away, leaving him raw and exposed. He walked toward her, his boots heavy. He needed to say something. "Thank you. I'm sorry. I was wrong." The words were a traffic jam in his throat. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He just stood there, looking down at her, at the silver scar that pulled at her eye, and for the first time he didn't see a victim. He saw a warrior. Vance finished with Miller's arm and looked up at him. Her gaze was level, without a trace of triumph or accusation. She simply held his eyes for a moment, and in that silence, Rivas felt the full weight of his foolishness. Sergeant Chun came and stood beside Rivas. He looked at Vance, then at the northern ridge where she had wrought a miracle, and then back at her. He didn't try to speak. He simply gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of profound, absolute respect. The low whump-whump-whump of inbound helicopters grew louder, and soon 2 Black Hawks were descending toward their position, kicking up a storm of dust. The extraction had arrived. Back at FOB Kestrel, the entire command staff was waiting on the tarmac. The news of what had happened, and who was responsible, had spread through the TOC like wildfire. The legend of Spectre was being whispered in hushed, awestruck tones. The Black Hawks landed, and the ramp dropped. The recon team emerged, carrying their wounded, their faces grim but alive. Rivas, supporting Miller, avoided everyone's gaze, his shame a heavy cloak. Vance was the last one off the helicopter. She carried her rifle and her pack, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She walked across the tarmac, heading for the armory, expecting to fade back into the background. But General Thorne stepped forward to meet her. He didn't speak. He didn't offer a handshake or a pat on the back. As she drew level with him, he snapped to attention with a speed and precision that belied his rank. He raised his hand in a salute. It was not the casual salute an officer gives a subordinate. It was sharp, perfect, and held with ramrod stillness. It was a salute of deference, of honor. Stunned into silence, every other officer on the tarmac followed his lead. The captain, the majors, the colonels, they all saluted her. Then, a movement from the side. Gunny Rivas, his face a mask of contrition, barked an order. Platoon, 10 hut. The entire force recon team, including Miller who was being helped by a medic, snapped to attention. They turned to face her, their bodies bruised and exhausted, and rendered their own salutes. They held the salute, their eyes locked on the scarred woman they had mocked just hours before. In the rigid hierarchy of the military, a general is saluted first. But on that dusty tarmac, under the harsh glare of the afternoon sun, they all saluted her. They saluted the sergeant major. They saluted Spectre. Vance stopped. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of surprise crossed her features. She looked at the general, at the operators, at the sea of saluting hands. She slowly, deliberately, raised her own hand and returned the salute to her commanding officer. A single, clean gesture that acknowledged everything without saying a word. The FOB was settling into the quiet rhythms of the night. The adrenaline of the morning's engagement had faded, replaced by the low hum of generators and the distant chatter of radios. In a small, dimly lit maintenance bay, away from the main barracks, Elara Vance was engaged in a familiar ritual. Her M110 rifle was disassembled on a clean canvas cloth, each component laid out in a precise, orderly fashion. Her scarred hands, which had been so steady and lethal hours earlier, now moved with a surgeon's grace, wiping down the bolt carrier with an oil-soaked rag, cleaning the carbon from the gas piston. This was her church, her form of meditation. The scent of solvent and gun oil was more comforting to her than any incense. The quiet scrape of boots on concrete announced a visitor. She didn't look up, already knowing who it was. General Thorne entered the bay, holding 2 heavy ceramic mugs of coffee. He moved without his usual entourage of aides, a solitary figure in the dim light. He didn't speak for a long time, simply watching her work. He observed the deep, ingrained familiarity she had with the weapon, the way her fingers traced the lines of the receiver as if greeting an old friend. He was watching a master at her craft, and the craft was not administration. Finally, he walked over and placed one of the mugs on the workbench beside her, the ceramic making a soft clink against the wood. The steam rose in a lazy curl, carrying the rich, dark aroma of fresh coffee. They officially retired that call sign, you know, Thorne said, his voice low, conversational. It wasn't the voice of a general addressing a subordinate. It was the voice of one professional speaking to another. After the Iron Curtain fell, said there was no need for ghosts anymore. Vance paused her work. She picked up a small brush and began cleaning the rifle's trigger group, her focus absolute. The world keeps finding uses for them, sir, she replied, her own voice just as quiet. Thorne took a sip from his mug, his eyes scanning the weapon parts laid out before her. My entire intelligence staff has been digging through your file for the last 6 hours. Most of it is just black ink on a page. But the parts that aren't, he trailed off, shaking his head slightly. The parts that aren't read like fiction. The paperwork is usually more pleasant than the reality, General. He allowed himself a small, grim smile. I can only imagine. He fell silent again, letting the comfortable quiet stretch between them. He had come here with a dozen questions, wanting to know about the missions, the history, the legend. But standing here, watching her, he realized the questions were unnecessary. The answers were right in front of him. In the calm precision of her hands, in the deep-set weariness of her eyes, in the scars that told stories far more eloquent than any after-action report. "Rivas came to see me," Thorne said after a while. "Tried to tender his resignation. Said he wasn't fit to lead." Vance looked up from her work for the first time, her gaze meeting his over the disassembled rifle. "What did you tell him, sir?" "I told him that the first sign of a good leader is recognizing when you've made a catastrophic error in judgment. The second is learning from it. I told him he was going to learn from this, and that he was lucky to have a teacher like you." She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and went back to her cleaning. She wasn't interested in apologies or punishments. She was interested in competence. If Rivas became a better, more thoughtful leader because of his humiliation, that was enough. The lives of his men depended on it. She began to reassemble the rifle. Each piece slid into place with a practiced, satisfying click. The bolt carrier group slid home. The receiver halves locked together. The trigger mechanism was seated. It was a process of restoration, of making a tool of chaos whole and orderly again. Thorne watched until the last piece was in place. The rifle was complete, a single, deadly piece of engineering. "The men, they're calling you the Ghost of Kestrel," he said. Vance racked the charging handle, the sound echoing sharply in the bay. She checked the chamber, then engaged the safety. Her work was done. She finally picked up the coffee mug he had brought her. Her scarred fingers, the skin tight and uneven, wrapped around the warm ceramic. She took a long, slow sip, her eyes looking past Thorne, out through the open bay door toward the dark, jagged silhouette of the mountains. The same mountains where she had held the lives of a dozen Marines in the crosshairs of her scope. "Some things don't retire, sir," she said, her voice a low murmur. "They just get filed away until you need them." She held the mug in both hands, letting the warmth seep into her bones. The general stood with her, both of them staring out into the hostile darkness, sharing a silence that was filled with unspoken understanding. The respect had been earned. The legend had been revealed. And now, there was only the quiet, the coffee, and the long night watch ahead.